been in Seattle now for about 8 years. I've been working with folks experiencing homelessness for about that same amount of time. Although in my new role at the Seattle King County Coalition on Homelessness, I coordinate trainings and meetings for social workers and case managers. I have brought a little sign-up sheet there. If you're interested in learning more about the coalition, it does policy, education, advocacy, a lot of voter registration. So because we're a nonprofit, we are having technical difficulties with our printer. So it's like half of a sign-up sheet, but feel free to print it out. So I was late. So yeah, I guess I do want to say I felt a little mixed about this event because I was excited about it highlighting the stories of folks that have experienced homelessness, and I have not been homeless. When Cassie asked me to participate, I did understand her point, though, that a lot of folks who are experiencing homelessness wouldn't be able to speak here because shelters have curfews. Folks, if you're staying outside, often want to get a good spot, make sure it's not taken. And a lot of people don't want to share that they're experiencing homelessness because it's embarrassing. And a lot of people don't like public speaking, which I also don't love. But I thought I would try to share some of my thoughts because this was at a library and I worked at the library for a while. I just want to be really aware that I can't really do justice to other people's stories, but I can try to talk about my own experiences and try to include, hopefully, experiences of folks who can't be here or don't feel comfortable sharing. So before I start talking about doing outreach at the library, I do want to really quickly talk about how I went from originally working at domestic violence shelters to doing outreach at the library with anyone that was experiencing homelessness. When I started working at DV shelters, I was really passionate about doing education around domestic violence, helping people overcome trauma. That's what I've experienced in my life, and I loved doing all of that work with my clients, doing little worksheets, talking about people's stories. That was sort of why I got into this work. But what I learned, probably really slowly, was that what people really wanted and needed first was a place to live. I remember when I was a new advocate working at a 30-day shelter, I was doing an intake, and I think this is when I was really new, just to my credit. And the woman said something like, she was like, oh, I want to start looking for housing right now. And I was like, oh, you just got here. And she was like, I don't have a place to live in a month. And I was like, oh, I'm sorry. And I don't think I said that anymore, hopefully, to anyone. So, yeah, I mean, I found over the course of when I worked at DV shelters, things were also changing. I was working at shelters for probably about 5 or 6 years, starting in 2010. And when I started, if someone came in who had a job or recent work history, often they could find a place that they could barely afford for themselves and their kids within a couple months. That was pretty normal. If they needed more support, we could often get them into a transitional housing program. I remember once looking at a list of everyone that was staying at the shelter I worked at, and everyone had like a place to go by the time that they were supposed to leave. We called it an exit plan. And by the time I stopped working at DV shelters, that was not the case anymore. If someone had recent work history and they could get into so if someone had recent work history and then they could get into a transitional housing program, maybe in the course of that program that was a couple years long, they could find an affordable place to live. Maybe. But in the stay of their time at the shelter, that almost never happened. If someone came in with a Section 8 voucher, so that's a voucher that pays for your housing, they're wonderful. It would take months and months to find a place that was cheap enough rent to accept the voucher. And sometimes the voucher would expire. And it used to be, when I had started doing this work, that if someone came in with a Section 8 voucher, like they would have a place within a week, maybe 2 weeks at the most. So that's just a little bit of context. And I guess to go back even a little bit further than that, my old boss, who had been working at the shelter that I was working at since the year I was born, said that in the early 90s, the wait list for the Seattle Housing Authority was less than a year. So our shelter was attached to a transitional housing program, which was a year. So if at the end of your stay you hadn't been able to find work, if you had several other barriers going on, you definitely could go to Seattle Housing Authority housing. Now that wait list, like they say it's 5 years, but I just have heard of people being on it for a lot longer than that. I'm doubtful. And so if you can't afford housing, you don't have a lot of options. Going back even further a little bit, well, a long ways, one of my former coworkers, who's one of my absolute favorite people in the world, and she does live in Tukwila, she's working right now. She just turned 60. Don't tell her I told you guys. And she was raised by a single mom who had 5 kids, and her mom obviously did a ton of things right, because she raised my coworker. But she did have a lot of barriers, and so they were on what was then called welfare for her entire childhood. And they didn't have any money, but they always had a place to live because welfare was enough to pay for a 3-bedroom townhouse in the Central District, which was then called the Colored District. And so now welfare is called TANF, and for 5 kids, like about $700, I think. So I haven't worked directly with folks who are on it for a year or 2. So that's not even enough money to rent a room for 1 person, much less 6 people, much less buy diapers and new shoes and pink things. I don't know. My niece is 6 and has like so many pink things. My sister, I think, had like a pink things budget. So so TANF is just, it's like almost enough to buy diapers for 5 kids. But so I guess going back to when I started working at the library, I am still very passionate about domestic violence, education, and prevention, and trauma, and all those things. But I really adored my clients a lot, and so I tried really hard to get as good at housing as I could. And I started to be more interested in what's called just more mainstream housing services, because really, it's all pretty much the same. It doesn't matter why someone doesn't have a place to live. What someone needs first is a place to live. It might be a different kind of place depending on the person, but it's still a place to live, and then they can do the things that everyone wants them to do, like learn about red flags of abuse, or have counseling, or employ, all those things. It's really hard to work on that. That is not the right page. On yourself, when you're just trying to figure out where to sleep and eat and get clean, and try to not stand out too much so people don't judge you. So I was really surprised when I started working at the library, and I actually kept being surprised, because even though I've been working at shelters for years at that point, I very quickly learned and continued to learn that I had no idea who was experiencing homelessness and who wasn't. So I would do outreach around the library and talk to people, and just sort of go up to people and tell them what I did and where to find me. And I didn't want anyone to feel self-conscious and feel like I was thinking they looked homeless. So I would just introduce myself to everyone in an area. I just say my name, again, a little about what I did. I don't like to put people on the spot. And so what surprised me was, without fail, it was always the people who I was sure were not experiencing homelessness that would ask me for help. It was always a person who I thought to myself, oh, they're studying, or they're waiting for a friend, or something. That was always a person who had questions right then, or came to find me, who it turned out was living in their car, or had been living in their car and it just got towed, or they had just lost their apartment the day before, and they didn't know where they were staying that night. And even after I knew that this always happened, I'd say to myself, okay, I know it's always the person I least expect, but definitely this person I'm about to talk to they're not experiencing homelessness, and they would be, obviously. And it was the same. I would have little drop-in hours where anyone could kind of come talk to me and ask questions, and it was the same thing. In about the first week, I realized that I needed to, when someone asked me what I was doing, make no assumptions in my answer about what they were going to ask me next, because I had no idea if someone walking up was going to ask me about housing, or say that, they were just something, I had no idea what I was doing, and nothing related to homelessness. I just didn't know. So I've been talking about being surprised about how many people were experiencing homelessness at the library that I wouldn't have expected. But there were also many people at the library who I would assume were experiencing homelessness, and usually I was right. I was thinking about this event in terms of the description, libraries, and community, and housing, and homelessness. And what is hard is, when I was working there, I did come to believe that almost everyone at the library was experiencing homelessness. I was maybe a little bit biased from who I was talking to, but that was how it seemed. But everyone's situation was unique. People weren't experiencing homelessness because of the same two reasons. Many folks had just experienced domestic violence. There was many folks who were seniors who had lost their housing because the rent increased, and their income was Social Security. Many people lost their apartments because they lost their job. There were so many reasons. And there was something else that really struck me was there were many young people who, when I asked when the last permanent housing they had, said that they've never really had permanent housing. They've grown up bouncing around families, in foster care, and since they became an adult, it's been the same. Often though, I did notice for folks that grew up without stable housing, this was the first time that they had stayed in a shelter or outside, because they'd always had a place to stay at friends or family before this, but now their friends and family were homeless as well, and so they didn't have a place to stay. I think a lot of folks, and I'm sure I have taken this for granted as well, don't realize the amount they rely on their support networks. Like, for instance, when I was 24, I had a place fall through at the last minute, so I stayed with my sister for almost a month until I found a new place to live. Like, if she had been on Section 8, where you can't have visitors for over 2 weeks, or else you can lose your housing. If, let's say, my best friend had also been homeless, if my dad had been in prison, it's not that my support network wouldn't have wanted to help me, but they couldn't have. So I think a lot of people, at least in Seattle right now, it seems like, are confused about all the people they see on the streets, and think that they don't really know anyone who's experiencing homelessness and that this doesn't affect them. And it seems like, first of all, I think people do know people that are experiencing homelessness. Lots of people I've worked with have said they don't tell anyone that they're homeless, either because it's embarrassing, or maybe because their family doesn't have the resources to help them, so they don't want to be a burden. One person told me once, I see my friends, and at the end of the evening, everyone goes home, and I go to my car. And he was like a few months from housing. I was not expecting to cry. When I lost my job, he was a few months from getting housing, so I just hope he did. So anyways, if you think you don't know anyone that's homeless, I think you probably actually do. But it's also because, as Cassie said, it's because of the widening income gap between communities and between races. Like I said, many people I've known had several family members who are homeless at the same time. So you could support each other emotionally, but not with money, yeah. And homelessness doesn't really happen to an individual, it happens to a community. I remember when I worked at the library, sometimes after work, I would be with my friends or family, and I would look around and just feel genuinely surprised that there were multiple people in the same place who weren't experiencing homelessness. And I'd be like, wow, what are the odds? We're all have housing and in the same place. And then I would remind myself that probably one of my friends and family was experiencing homelessness and wasn't telling me. But that's just what the scope of the problem seemed like when I was working at the library. And even today, I work in Pioneer Square, and I just see so many people on the street who look visibly like they're experiencing homelessness. And I know that most of the people who are experiencing homelessness are just walking right by me, and I don't know that they're experiencing homelessness. And I guess I feel like at the library I talk to so many folks that were experiencing homelessness, like multiple new people a day. And I feel like I should just know some percentage of people in Seattle that are homeless, like even a small percentage. And I don't. I hardly recognize anyone that I see who's currently experiencing homelessness. And it makes me feel like the problem is just so much bigger than we know.